Okay, I do have us right at 1:30. I am going to, oh, we are recording. Excellent. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Nope, you're coming here.
I'm going to ask you to mute your microphones if you're not asking a question. We will have designated times for questions throughout. You can always put your question in the chat. If you want to stay anonymous, you can private message me or Dan. I am Mary Beth Schaefer. I'm from the Central Kansas Library System. And Dan, take it away.
I'm Dan Alexander. I am a library consultant from Northeast Kansas Library System. We are your two moderators for today. As Mary Beth said, if you have any questions, feel free to private chat us like so many people have been doing already. I just wanted to go over this after lunch course. This is a 4-part series for 2021. We have Mr. LaRue today. He'll join us again in December. Let's see, I have the dates in front of me. Looks like the 22nd talk will be with Jamie LaRue in December 9th. And then we'll have library ethics and also customer service with Pat Wagner. That was customer service is going to be June 10th and library ethics on September 9th, it looks like. Only other thing I wanted to say was thanks to all the systems for coming together to work on this project. Mary Beth is going to mention the evaluation, and we've already kind of talked about it, but I wanted to encourage you, if you enjoy what you see today, please reach out to your assistant consultants as well, just to drop them a line and let them know that you appreciate this type of programming being brought to you free of charge for all of our participants today. I think that is all I've got, so I'll turn it back over to Mary Beth. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. Yes, so just a couple housekeeping notes. Please make sure that you keep yourself muted unless you're asking a question. That will reduce any background noise. If I notice some background noise, I may mute you and you'll get a little notification that I muted you. That doesn't mean you can't ask your question. It just means I'm trying to keep things clear in the background. Jamie will have some designated times to take questions. He will see them in the chat if you put them for everybody. If you message us privately, we will make sure that your questions get asked. If you do unmute yourself to ask a question, please give us your name and your library. Let's see. We will have this archived. It is recording right now, and we will post that archive once it's available. And then we do have the evaluation survey that we will send out at the end of this meeting. We will also send it out as an email on CanLibel, and if you registered to your registered email. And that's going to help us to know what we're doing right and how we can make this event last for several years. We're hoping to keep this 4-part series going for several years. All right, and now it's time for Jamie LaRue. LaRue is the former executive director of the ALA's Office for Intellectual Freedom and the Freedom to Read Foundation. Author of The New Inquisition, Understanding and Managing Intellectual Freedom Challenges, LaRue was a public library director for many years, including a 24-year tenure as director of the Douglas County Libraries in Colorado, as well as a weekly newspaper columnist and TV host. He has written, spoken, and consulted on leadership and organizational development, community engagement, and future libraries. Welcome, Jamie.
Thank you so much, Mary Beth. And give me a moment here while I share the screen, and let's see if we can get everything working. Okay, and I just have to give one quick little correction because I'm doing this on a tiny little screen. I can't see the chat as it comes through. So again, I'll stop at various points along the way to see if there are any questions that have gone into the chat for the moderators to read. And I'll take questions at the end as well. So I have worked in many kinds of libraries. I lived for a while in Arizona where I actually founded a little tiny library in Arivaca, and population 300. I eventually went on to be assistant director and director of various city libraries at various sizes. And in 1990, I went to Douglas County in Colorado, just south of Denver, and was fascinated by the job. And it seemed to me that this was a library that was poised on the edge of greatness. On the other hand, in 1990, the Douglas County Libraries was the worst ranked library in the state of Colorado. And by that, I mean we were open 5 days a week. We had one story time a week. We had one reference librarian that went around 4 different locations. We had the fewest books per capita. We had the lowest per capita. But it was also a beautiful place. And I had the sense it was about to take off. A population of about maybe 65,000 at the time. So when I took the job, I took it because I really believe, I have come to believe, that the strongest kind of library governance is the library district. And again, I've worked in township libraries, I've worked in county libraries, I've worked in even private libraries, but I truly believe that the district library gives you the ability to go directly to the public and ask for money. So I said, if you hire me, I'll get a chance finally to run a campaign to see if we can establish a library district, convert from a county library. And they said, okay, that sounds really good. So you're hired. And then I went out. I was hired on, I think, March 27th. The first day was April 1st, no coincidence. And the election was going to be November. And so I immediately began campaigning. And at first I tried to do all the usual stuff. Libraries are wonderful, but it really wasn't catching on. And two things happened that made me kind of focus this idea about how do we establish a firm library advocacy campaign to establish a library district. And I found that what worked best was I would go up to these groups and I would say, we are the worst ranked library in the state of Colorado. And it really was a campaign of shame. So by saying, gee, people would say, you mean we're even worse than neighbor to the left? I'd say, oh yeah, even worse than them. And what I found was that kind of appeal to a civic pride. As I went around at the beginning and I was talking to what I think of as all the usual suspects, the mayors of the various towns, the head of the newspaper, the head of the Chamber of Commerce, and every single one of them, all men, said the same thing to me. They said, Jamie, it's too bad about the library, but this is a very conservative community, very Republican, very anti-tax, and I just can't imagine that you're going to have much of a chance. And I was understandably depressed about that, but I went back to my office and I was talking to someone who worked with our Dynex system, and I said, just out of curiosity, what percentage of our patrons are male and what percentage are female? And we did have a spot in the database at that time to indicate both the year of birth and gender, which they got to choose themselves. And it turned out that we had about 87% of our active users were women. And I said, why am I talking to men? And after that, I really focused on, we need to build a library we can be proud of, because women in our society are responsible for the establishment of almost 98% of the public libraries in America. Women are the keepers of culture in our society. Well, the good news was I did lots and lots of talks to every group of women that I could find, mom cooperative parenting, babysitting cooperatives, charter schools, everything I could think of. And then when we got to the opening day, the voting day, I showed up and walked into the room where they were still tallying the results and displaying them on an overhead projector. And ta-da, we won. We successfully established a independent library district, more than doubled our funding, and we carried the vote by 66%. So I thought, fantastic. Well, over the next couple of years here, I'm missing there we go. So over the next couple of years, we just kept our promises, and we opened up 7 days a week. We started doing 3 story times a day, sometimes 5 story times a day at some of our locations. We bought lots and lots of books. We started to add a lot of people. And during that time, between 1990 and 1996, there was an anti-tax activist who came into Colorado, and he picked up some legislation from California, kind of Prop 13 sort of stuff, and pushed through something that really limited the ability of government to automatically collect more taxes as the county grew. And so at about that time, Douglas County took off in population. There were 65,000 people in 1990. By 1996, there were almost 200,000. Today, there are almost 350,000. So from 1990 through the year 2000, Douglas County was the fastest growing county in the United States. And so we really needed that money to be able to keep up with things. But because we had some of that funding, because we were an independent entity and we were only focused on libraries, we were able to say, we keep our promises. And so I went back and I said, okay, how are things going to go? Excuse me for jumping back and forth here on the slides. And I thought I was so confident we were going to work, because which is better, a campaign of shame, we are so bad, please make us better, or you can trust us, we keep our promises. So I went into this second election to say, we have the opportunity to say, please exempt us from this tax limitation, because we know the county is growing and we want to be able to build, and we're going to save the money and pay cash for things instead of going into debt. And so when I went into the election that night, I was, again, very confident. And I found, much to my surprise, that as I walked into the room, we were losing. And usually the early vote that comes in is a pretty good predictor of what's going to happen in the election. So I sat there watching the tallies go up and down by 0.1% and 1 percentage point. And that's what happened to most of my hair that night, watching those returns come in. I was going, oh my God. And finally, we won, but we won by just 1%. And I was astonished. I thought, now we have a reputation. We have established ourselves as trustworthy. How is it possible that it should be so close after 6 years of being really productive? Well, at about that time, our county had come up with something called the Geographic Information Systems. And I kind of had this idea. I went to them and I said, so if I were to give you a deduped list of my patron addresses, no identifying information, just names, could you lay that down over the list of all of the households in the county so I can find out exactly what percentage of our community has a library card, active households? And they said, sure, we would love to do that. That's fascinating. And here's what I found out, that 51% of our community, of all the households, had an active library card. We won by 51%. I also took a look at precinct results, and when I went back, I found that in those precincts where more than 50% of the population had an active library card, and again, I'm talking households, not just people, we won. When we had fewer than 50% of the households with an active library card, we lost. So I came up with this hypothesis. Voting results correlate with percentage of households with an active library card, so do precinct results. Therefore, if we could just grow market penetration, if I could get more than 51% of our community using the library, I thought we could win elections. So for the next 10 years, I worked on this philosophy. And you see our old logo that we came up with back in 1996. And here's what I believe. If you begin at the very bottom of this graphic and you just open your doors, that is, you have a circulating collection, you have some reference services, there's some children's story times, you have general public programs, there's access to technology, maybe you even have a meeting room, 30 to 50% of the population will find you. And I heard that Pat Wagner will be coming to speak with you, and Pat's a good friend of mine, and she often says, many librarians believe, oh, we serve everybody. But that's not true. They only serve the people who show up. And so what I found was that 30 to 50% of the population are the people who used libraries as children. That tends to be your user base, and they will find the library if you open it. But that's not a reliable way to win an election. So I said, well, what's the next step? And about that point, I heard about a group called Cahoots Incorporated. And this was a team of sisters. And one of them was sort of thought up all the ad stuff, and the other one did all the graphics. And I first read about them because they were so good at what they did. Their very first client was a small manufacturer. And they managed to ramp up enough demand for what he was manufacturing that they actually put him out of business. And I thought, well, that's effective advertising. So what can you tell us? I contacted Cahoots. I said, can you help us? And they said, sure, we'll start like this. Give me a copy of every piece of collateral you have. And I said, what do you mean collateral? And they said, well, what's the form that somebody has to fill out to get a library card? What is the application for the summer reading program? When you stick a sign on the door because you're closing early because of snow, let me see a copy of that sign. I want to see your library card. I want to see the overdue notice. I want to see every flyer that you hand out. Well, you can imagine when you first hear that, that's a lot of stuff. And we boxed up about 6 large boxes and sent it off to them. And they said, okay, give us some time to look through all this. And they came back about 6 weeks later with a look in their eyes that I can only describe as pity. And they said, ooh, we thought librarians were smart. And I said, what do you mean? And they said, do you need any kind of advanced training to become a librarian? I said, well, yes, of course. You know, we have a master's of library science. And they said, you know, you also need advanced training to become a graphic designer. And they said, here's what, as painful as this is, here's what you need to know. Right now, everything you're doing for graphics and for kind of public relations, one-way communication, remember us fondly and often. You're amateurs. You're just not doing it very well. And the way this would work within our libraries, we'd say, okay, we got an idea for a program. Oh, look, I have a bunch of yellow paper. Yellow is good. It really pops up. You know, let's go ahead and put it on that. And then I run out of the flyer and I print it again on green or on orange, because orange is even more, it pops even better. And so what happens is advertisers understand that you have to see something in pretty much the same format, same graphics, same fonts, 7 to 13 times before you see it for the first time. And when you redo a flyer in a different color, you're starting all over again. So they said, what we need to tell you is that just because you have 1,000 fonts in your computer doesn't mean you need to use them all on every flyer. From now on, you just have three fonts. One is for the text, that's a serif font. One is for headlines, that's a sans serif font. And one more decorative font that you can use to be creative. And I was so astonished that when we did this to people, to say, if we want to be effective at our advertising, to remind people that we're out there, we have to step up our game. We have to become more professional. We have to stop being amateurs. And this is when I found out that virtually everybody who worked for me considered themselves to be gifted designers. And it took almost 2 years for us to get people so that they would follow the Bible, that they would only use the logo in one format. We wouldn't flip it on its side. We wouldn't stretch it. We wouldn't change its colors. It would always be in the same place on a piece of paper, that we only had those 2 fonts. And very quickly I realized that that meant that if somebody was just walking through a grocery store and saw one of our flyers, they could immediately recognize it from across the room, even before they read it. And so that brand management was a way for us to really pull our act together and let people know that there was a library. At about the same time, I found out that, you know, to go back to say, how is it that somebody becomes a library user? I mentioned that most of the people that will find a library went there because their parents took them as kids. And then they kind of drift away from the library. And then what brings them back? What brings them back is a life change. Typically, they're having their own children. Or they've lost their job and they're retooling, or they're applying for a new job, or there's a health crisis, or there's a major consumer purchases. There's some fairly predictable things, but they're not just going to think of the library when they hit that life crisis. The message needs to be out there. And so by being very disciplined and consistent and with your public relations, I believe this is one of the ways you can reach those people at the time when they are open to your message. Well, as I mentioned, we did this for 2 years, and then I went back to the GIS system, and I said, did it move the needle? And sure enough, we had gone from 51% of the households with the library card to 64% of the households. That's progress. So we said, okay, well, that's good. That's just letting people know what we do. Now let's talk about two-way communications, not just remember the library, but tell us about your life. And one of the things that I learned in this process is that when you're going out and asking people questions, you know, you're doing this to understand what is the environment in which we operate. And by the kinds of questions that I think you need to ask are not things like, what can the library do to serve you better? Because the simple truth of it is that people don't know. They're not in the library business. And so that's not their job, that's your job. And instead, I think it's much smarter to say, tell me what you did today at the library. Or, you know, one of the questions we asked, when was the last time you purchased a car? Does your car have an audio playing device? Is it an audio tape? Is it a CD player? What do you use? And then after looking at all that, we could come back and say, you know, it's very clear that our patrons have shifted over at that point from the audio to the CD. And now, of course, from the CD to, you know, streaming. But the idea about marketing is first you have that deep conversation with somebody where you say, tell us about your life. Tell me what you're thinking about. Tell us about where do you find books? Where do you find movies? Where do you go to have interesting conversations? And to give you some examples of this, you know, with the GIS system, I could highlight those families in our community that didn't have a library card, and we could send them a piece of mail. And so as we went through this, we sent things to people that said things like, we noticed that you got your library card, but then you never used it again. Is there something wrong? Did we do something wrong? Or why did you get the library card since we can't detect any activity? And we found through many of the responses from that one, some were very funny. One woman wrote back and said, I'm so sorry, I was seduced by America online. I swear to God, I'll start reading again. And other people said, you know, I signed up to get the library card because I needed access to the database for some research that I'm doing. And we didn't have a way to count that at that time. And then one of my favorite ones, we did kind of a pizza party for some teens. And the teens showed up, and we found that when you're doing this kind of a focus group, you don't want to be doing this as library staff because people don't want to hurt your feelings. So we had to bring in somebody who was not affiliated with the library, but was a skilled facilitator. And he asked this group of teenagers, you know, so tell us about your day and tell us about the kinds of things that you do. And then there was this one very articulate young man, and he said, you know, I don't go to the library. And the facilitator said, well, why not? And this young man said, well, it's because I don't like the smell of books. Doesn't that just break your heart? And when I first heard that, I thought, oh my God, that's just terrible. But then I thought, you know, if you can smell the books, maybe it's because we have a mold problem. I mean, maybe our issue is that we need to weed things a little bit better. So bottom line, we did lots and lots of focus groups and surveys and everything from standing outside the library just to say, please tell us everything you did while you were here today. And we found out so many interesting things with that too. The number one reason that people came to the public library was to check something out. They wanted to bring something home. The number two reason was because they wanted to bring it back. That's good because that means you're not losing inventory. But the number three reason was fascinating to me, and it was I came to talk to someone. It wasn't necessarily staff, it wasn't necessarily, you know, a regular kind of appointment, but it was like, this is a place where if I'm running my business from home, this is where I come to meet my clients. Or it could be that I do like to check in with one of our circulation clerks, and then I like to go sit in the magazine section where I have a couple of friends that are doing some investing. And so this idea was that, yes, in the popular mind, we are seen as a supplier of books, but it was very clear that we had a deep responsibility connection to our community, that just interpersonal connection. This has become even clearer through the pandemic, where we see that tremendous thirst for connection in our community. 2 years of that, and we went back and did another GIS sample and found that we were now up to 84% of the population. 84% of our households had an active library card. And we had made many changes to our services as a consequence of these two-way communications. Well, 84% is pretty good. But then I got interested in this whole graphic here to say, what does it take to track down the last library patron? You know, so we start off, we opened the doors, we got 50%, we did one-way communications, we got to 65, we opened up to really thoughtful marketing, and now we're up to 84%. What else can we do? And it occurred to us that at that point, maybe we needed to leave the building. And I'll tell you one last story about this development of services, and then we'll get to the heart of telling the library story. One day I had a reference librarian, had just gotten her library degree, and she walked into my office and said, I have a question. Did I make a mistake in getting a library degree? Do we even need reference librarians anymore? And she asked that for at least two reasons. One of them is, just even in the time she had been there, at that point about a year, she had seen a change as the internet began to, really get more and more present in our community. All of those easy questions that the public used to ask us didn't come to us anymore. People just looked them up on their smartphone. And so we noticed there was a real shift in questions, and the number of questions was dropping. The second thing we noticed was that I had heard about a study that had been done in the Pacific Northwest, where they said, do you need an MLS to answer reference questions? And based on their studies, they found that 80% of the time you did not. That with sufficient training and some awareness of the collection and some good training for reference interviews, most people can do pretty well. 20% of the time, you really have to have some special expertise. But clearly, 80% of the time, we could think about how we staffed things. Well, then I got to thinking that one of the things that I did as a library director, and I'm sure this is true for many of you, is you go to a lot of community meetings. And I said to my young librarian, Colby, I said, Colby, I'm really glad that you've asked us, because I've noticed the same conversations coming up in many of the communities that, whose meetings I attend. And right now we have an issue in the town of Parker, and I want to bring you to a meeting of Main Street property owners. So I walked into the meeting with Colby, and I said, I know that you 80 people have been getting together to talk about what can we do to kind of help our community? And we know that they're going to be ripping up Main Street to put in a new sewer line. Your question is, do we have to put it back the same way? Or could we use this opportunity of a streetscape change to really make our businesses stronger downtown? I said, so the work that you're doing is so important. I have decided to dedicate a reference librarian to your effort. And they looked completely baffled. Like, oh, gee, is this like getting a mascot or something? But they were open to it and friendly. And about 2 weeks later, Colby came back and she said, okay, I've been watching them, and I think there are two real leaders here. Is that correct? I said, that's right. You've got the right two. She said, well, what do we do now? I said, now I want you to take them out on the library dime for lunch, you and your branch manager, and I want you to do an in-depth interview with them, to ask them, what are you trying to accomplish with this change? Tell us about your traffic patterns and what times of day are busiest for you. Do you notice that people are shopping at more than one place, or is it like you're a destination and then they leave? So they went off and they did these interviews, and they came back about as excited as I've ever seen a reference librarian. And they said, you know what? They really need this. These are meaty questions that are not easily Googleable. And two examples of this is that we're trying to brand our downtown. We want this to be Western architecture. What is Western architecture? What does that even mean? Second, what's the best way for people to park on Main Street to generate pedestrian activity? Angle parking or parallel parking? And so we got a whole bunch of questions like that, and then sat down to say, okay, well, what next? And everybody very quickly said, okay, well, I like this question, I like this question, and off they went to do all of the research. And as many of you know, reference librarians, live for the thrill of the chase. They love to look. And they came back with all this great information. But then I said to them, well, let's think about this. With these 80 business people, what's our usual reference transaction? Somebody comes in and they ask us a question. We help them figure out what the question is. We give them some resources and we say, come back if you need any help. So now we have all this bushel baskets of books and magazine articles and digital printouts. Do we just put them in a shopping cart and hand them to the business people? And everyone shook their head and said, no, they want something better than that. Well, what do they want? And we finally realized that what they really wanted was something like an executive summary. Give us 2 pages. And so we did that. Our staff sat down and said, okay, I remember writing executive summaries. I used to be a medical librarian and we had to do that a lot. And so they worked out 8 position papers of 2 pages apiece. And then I said, so do we think this will work? Is this what they want? And Colby by this point said, now I know these guys. And because they're business people, they are not going to accept it unless they have a PowerPoint. And that was the moment when I realized that probably 80% of my reference staff was more afraid of public speaking than they were afraid of dying. But by this point, Colby said, no, I'm fearless. I don't really want to do the PowerPoint. I don't feel like I have great expertise with that, but I'm perfectly comfortable delivering it. So other staff put together the PowerPoint. She walked in and stood up in front of 80 people and went through and said things like this. You asked, which is more conducive to pedestrian-friendly streetscapes, angle parking or parallel? Parallel, she said. Next slide. And I just love this because what that did was it showed the librarians in a new light. It showed us not just as giving you resources, as being a friendly face at the library, but somebody who actually left the library, went out to find the question that none of these business people would have brought to the library, but sought it out, found the answer, and delivered it. Well, when Colby finished, she got a standing ovation and a round of applause, and I thought that was fantastic. So then I went up in front of them and I said, so I want to let you know that this project is now done. I'm taking Colby back. And I saw a look of consternation on all these business people's faces, and they said, but we need a librarian. So a standing ovation and we need librarians, I thought was definitely progress. As I was wrapping this up, I said, because I'm wrapping this up, I'd like to ask you a question. What was the value that we brought to you? And I expected them to say, we ask questions and you answer them, but they said, really, the value was this. When we went to the town and they said, don't put it back the way it was. Don't put that big median planter in the center anymore. And the town staff said, well, where'd you get this alternative ideas? They said, well, the library helped us research this. And they went, oh, okay. In other words, the library gave the business community credibility for an idea for a new redesign for Main Street. And I'm very pleased to say that that redesign went through. A lot of the dark shops there all got filled, and Main Street of Parker was redone because the library stepped in to help them. And I also learned a very powerful lesson. If you really want to find out how valuable you are, you kind of have to tell people that the project is over. And my last question to that group of business people was, what do you think the dollar value of our service was? And first thing that happened was no one would meet my eye. Oh my God, he's going to charge us. But then when they did, somebody said, I actually just did some business intelligence research, and the services you provided to us were at least $10,000 to $15,000. And I said to them, so recognize that this service was prepaid through your taxes. None of you together put in $10,000 worth of taxes for the library, but you got $10,000 worth of service, and we remade downtown. Now, I don't know how many more of a percentage that we would have gotten from this because, and I also don't know, I say, can we get 5 to 15% of the population by leaving the building and answering those community reference questions? And then what percentage at the top of this is unreachable? What people are you just never going to get to use the library? And I don't know the answer to that, but I know you can get at least to that 85% and probably up to 90%. So here we were by the year 2006. We had 84% of our households with an active library card. Our circulation had gone up to 27 circs per capita. We were checking out over 8.2 million books a year. We had built 7 libraries without any debt at all. We had maintained our campaign promises from before. The community was clearly growing. There was a lot of need for space. We had shown we could anticipate that. And that was the year in 2006 that it was then called the Hennon American Public Library Rankings. And Douglas County had gone from the worst in the state to #1 in the nation for our population size. And so our tagline was invest in the best. So I confidently walked into our election day results, and we lost. We lost by 1%. So I raise all of this to say, this taught me that everything I had believed about librarianship, that if I could just secure enough library cards, enough users, that I would get support, had been proven to be false. I was wrong. I was also depressed for reasons that I think are understandable. And about that time, I was a member of the OCLC Members Council. And that was the year, 2006, where they rolled out preliminary results for their From Awareness to Funding study. And what they had found was this. They said, well, I'm going to tell you something that is so unbelievable that will rock you to your core. And she puts up the first slide, and this was the vice president of marketing at the time. And she said, we talked to over 8,000 people, and here's what we learned. Library use has nothing to do with support. And I all but jumped out of my chair and said, by God, that's true. Because I remembered I was standing outside the Douglas County Libraries when a patron is coming out, and she's got a bushel basket full of kids' books. And I'm trying to hand her a flyer that says, vote for the library. And I said, I hope we can count on your support. She said, my taxes are too high. Here was someone who came to the library twice a week, walked out with 20 books every time for her kids, but her taxes were too high. Then I thought about a library to the north where we had a gentleman in his 80s, and he would come into this library, different library district every day, or different than ours, but he would come in every day. And he would say, look at this magnificent library. I chose this community because a community that invests in a library is a good community. And the library director heard about this, and she said, Joe, that's a great speech you give. Can you just work in the fact that we have DVDs? And he said, you have DVDs?
Jamie, I am not hearing you.
It's pretty straightforward.
Oh, there we go.
Oh, is it on the screen?
It's on the screen. We lost your sound for just a second, but you're back.
Okay, my apologies.
That's okay.
The vagaries of the internet there. And so what they found was that your willingness to vote for the library came down to your perception of the librarian. And by librarian, that meant whoever you talked to at the library who worked there. MLS doesn't have much to do with it. If they believed that you were a passionate advocate for literacy and learning, then they voted for the library. And then there was also this whole thing about voters who see the library as transformational as opposed to transactional, meaning it's not just I came in and you gave me a book. I came in and you gave me a book because you knew what I might be interested in and it changed my life. If I have that kind of a story, I'm going to support the library. Well, this was important because I had stumbled across something that many libraries may have learned through their own attempts. Over the past 25 years, and this was back in 2006, library use had been increasing. And I think that's because all of our marketing was for use. It really wasn't for value. It was for, we thought use meant support, but that was not the case. So then I got so fascinated by all this to say, well, then how do you change somebody's mind if they haven't had that wonderful experience with the librarian, if they haven't had the transformational, how do we get someone to go from my taxes are too high to I support the library and I will always show up? And I ran across all these books that have come out lately about brain research, and they're very, very powerful and insightful. And I'll just kind of give you my takeaway from each one of these. The first one was The Happiness Hypothesis by Jonathan Haidt. And the main thing that he said was that we are not rational. And here's a story that stayed with me. There's a man who's driving along in Michigan on an icy road, and he slips out on some ice, runs into a telephone pole, smashes his head into the driver column. When he wakes up in the hospital, they say, can you understand me? And he said, oh, yes. Can you wiggle your fingers and toes? Oh, yes. Can you sit up? Yes. Can you have a conversation? Well, I certainly can. And they said, well, we're very surprised. We thought you had had significant brain injury, but you seem to be fine. And so they let him go home. And about 2 weeks later, he came back and said, no, you're right. Something is terribly wrong. I can't feel anything. I have no emotional response. And my first thought as I was reading that is like, that would be like being Spock, it'd be kind of cool. It's like no longer befuddled by all that emotional maelstrom of the brain. It's like either it's logical, Captain, or it's not. But it turns out that if you don't have emotional responses to things, you can't make up your mind at all. So this guy would wake up in the morning and he would say, okay, I need breakfast. Maybe I'll have cornflakes because it's good to have fiber. Then he would say, but, maybe I need protein, and so I should have eggs. And then he would, on the other hand, because it turns out that the way human beings make decisions is we have an emotional reaction, and then we arrange the evidence to justify it. We are not thinking creatures who feel. We are feeling creatures who think. So that's significant. Another book, How We Decide by Jonathan LaRue. What he found was that all of our emotions, though, are designed to predict the future. And very, very often when people do studies with things like a galvanic skin responses, and they'd play games like with cards, and the rules would be every time you draw from this deck, this has poison cards in it, and the other decks are okay. The skin response detected that discomfort with the pile with the poison cards in it long before it was conscious. So emotions are not irrational, but they come first. And then My Stroke of Insight by Jill Bolte Taylor is a wonderful story about a woman who, she was a neurosurgeon, brain scientist herself in Boston. Woke up one day, and as she was exercising on her exercise bicycle, things started to get weird. She started to feel the whole left side of her body merging with the wall. And she thought, God, that's odd. And as she's walking along, suddenly all of that chatter that goes on in the brain all of the time stopped. And she just had a moment of absolute, almost bliss, just extraordinary peace. And then she realized, oh, I see what's happening. I'm having a stroke. And she said, well, I better call the hospital. And so she went to the phone and picked it up and suddenly realized that she no longer remembered how to dial a phone. And she said, oh, I'll call the office. And then she realized she couldn't remember the number of her office. And so she found one of her cards, and then kind of like a illiterate person, she would match the shape of the number on the phone, and she dialed her office. And when they answered, she found she was no longer able to speak. But they recognized her voice, and they recognized the number, sent an ambulance to her, and that's when she found out she had a stroke. The whole left side of her brain had been flooded with blood. The left side of the brain is the one that has all of our language. And it also has the part of the brain that seems to be about storytelling. And so Taylor, for the first year that she was kind of recovering from this, found that she, when that brain would fall silent because the language was damaged, she felt almost like she could see people's auras. She was always responding to people's emotional kind of energy. And then one day, kind of like a faulty hard drive coming back online, it started to make comments to her brain. And so as she's sitting there in her hospital room, the nurse comes in and the nurse is frowning. And the left side of Jill Bolte Taylor's brain says to her, she doesn't like you. But because she hadn't heard anything from that monkey mind, from that chattering mind for the past year, she reacted to it emotionally. And she said, ooh, I don't like that. Tell me another story. And it turns out that the human brain is unusually good at generating stories. We can always explain things to ourselves. And so second attempt was, well, maybe she's had a hard day. And Jill Taylor says, I like that answer much better because it gives me compassion for her. And so what she wound up doing, because the left side of the brain had gone offline and then came back online, is she reprogrammed her brain to only tell her things that made her feel good about it. You can look up her story on YouTube and see her give a speech, and Jill Bolte Taylor is now a being of light. You can see she has reprogrammed herself to be a far kinder and more loving person. And then finally, this book, Being Wrong by Catherine Schultz. I just absolutely love this book. It is often very funny. And she started by saying, gee, have you ever been wrong? Has anybody here ever been wrong? And all of her friends would say, oh, yeah, if you're doing research about that, come talk to me. Because, boy, I'm wrong a lot. And she'd say, great, tell me about a time when you were wrong. And that's when she found out that very few people can remember a time when they were wrong. And here's why. We all have that experience. You're talking, something is coming out of your mouth, and all of a sudden you go, oh, gee, do I still think that's true? I feel uncomfortable with that. And then somebody challenges you on it, and they say, you're wrong. And what almost everybody does is say, no, I'm not, you are. And we dig in our heels and we defy. When we are directly contradicted or we are given information that we disagree with, first step is denial. And then the second step is you might come back and say, well, you know what? I was almost right. I was right about almost everything except this one small piece. And then the third stage of denial is to come back and say, well, you know, it wasn't that I was wrong. It's that the people who told me things, they were wrong and I believed them. And so then on, and eventually you never get to the point where you say,
doing too many things.
I'm sorry? Sorry, there was a comment there?
I think it's just an error.
Okay. So at any rate, no one ever says, I used to be wrong, but now I got it figured out. They say, I never really believed that. Nobody ever says, you know, they don't think when they're getting married that they're going to get divorced. But when they get divorced, they go, from the beginning, I knew. So all of these things kind of tell us that if we want to change somebody's mind, we have to start with their hearts. And the best way to get into somebody's mind is through a story. So here is the problem statement that I think all libraries are facing. Fewer libraries make it to the ballot or win when they do. Public support for public libraries is declining. That is a fact that has been true over the past 25, 30 years. And now, in many locations around the country, public library use, this is even before the pandemic, obviously, now use is declining too. And so clearly, the advocacy efforts of the librarian profession over the past 25 years have not been effective. We need a different strategy. And I believe that brain research points the way to do it. So now I'm going to tell you a story, and I'm going to come back and kind of take it apart. Caden was 3 years old. He was a very, very bright little boy. And like many bright young boys, happens more often with boys than with girls, he went through a stage of stuttering. And usually it's no big deal. All you have to do is, you know, you do rhymes with them, you sing with them, but mainly you're just patient. And it writes itself. The brain is just trying to synchronize with the tongue. And for many of us, the brain goes too fast. And it's no big deal. It settles down. But Caden's father was a jerk. And every time Caden would stutter, his father would stutter with him. He'd say your name again, Caden, and he'd laugh. Well, this went on for about 2 years. And during that time, the wife decided the husband was abusive in other ways, and she got rid of him. But by then, Caden had a problem. He stuttered badly. But Caden was so bright. Like 1% of the human race, Caden taught himself to read. His mother brought him to the library every day and, you know, checked out a lot of books to him, but he taught himself to read. And so at the age of 5, he looks over one day and he sees this little girl reading to our next character, Max. And Max was a retired greyhound. Retired because on his very first race, he burst out of the gate, ran around the track, saw, stopped, smelled, and watered the roses. This ended his racing career. But he was then adopted by a childless couple who then found out that Max adored kids. So they took him to service training to be a read to the dog part of our program, and brought him in once or twice a week to have kids read to him. So Caden saw this little girl reading to Max, and when she got up and left, he trotted over and sat down and started to read too. But after he got into a little bit, he got stuck. And finally, he set the book down, and half in shame, half in anguish, he just looked at the dog as his mother watched. And without saying anything, of course, the dog reached out, put its paw on his forearm, and looked at him, radiating love and patience. Caden took a breath, and he started to read again. Now, I'm not saying that all of Caden's problems disappeared in that moment, but his mother was still watching. And she said, I'm going to bring him back to read to that dog every day that he's here. And I'm going to get him some speech therapy. Well, about 4 years went by. And then the library director got a letter from the mother, and she said, just wanted to let you know that Caden was just cast in the lead role in 4th grade as the Wizard of Oz. Caden doesn't stutter anymore. Thank you, she said, for saving the life of my son. In that year alone, over 132 children were read to in just 3 months, and read to dogs, giving them a big boost up. And what we've also learned is that the investment in child literacy is the best single predictor of how healthy your child will be as a child, how long they will live as an adult, whether or not they're going to be in jail or free, and how much money they're going to make. Libraries transform lives. So that's a library story. Now let's unpack that. To tell a successful and powerful library story, you need to do these things. First, you have to give me a real person. And by that, I mean an individual. You can't say, senior citizens love the library. You have to say, Norma was a 92-year-old blind woman who found the library, okay? Then you have to give me a real problem. And the problem in a library story is essential for that emotional piece. What happens is the way we are wired as human beings is when there's an issue, our ears perk up. Caden is 3 years old. That doesn't take very much to nail that down. Give me that problem that he stuttered, and now you have my attention. It's a hook. And then, and this is a very important thing in telling the library story, then we need library as supporting character, not as the main character. The library action is we offer a read to dog program, but the focus remains on Caden, not on the library. And then finally, I need a happy ending. He doesn't stutter anymore. Why is the happy ending important? It's important because in that moment of the release of tension, and remember I said that, you know, if someone tells me I'm wrong, I immediately dig in my heels and I defy them. Well, because I was emotionally invested in the story, when the happy ending comes, for a moment, the relief is so great, and oxytocin, kind of releases itself in the brain, and I start to feel better about this. And in that moment, my bias, my resistance disappears, and my brain is open for a change. And at that point, librarians need to give one fact. We had 132 children. And then an ending with that tagline, libraries transform lives. All of those things together mean it started off where you gave me a real person. I got emotionally connected. The library saved the day. There was a happy ending. I've got one fact to assure me that this isn't made up. This is realistic. This is possible. And then give me something that my preacher friends would say, this is the phrase that pays. Remember a story, libraries transform lives. Actually, I want to stop there. Does anybody have any questions about this? And I'm going to ask our moderators, good point to check into the chat and see how things are going. Do we have a backlog of questions, or people just listening along? I
think they're just listening along, Jamie. I might be wrong, but I didn't see anything really popping out.
Okay. I didn't see any questions popping out, but a lot of conversation about your key talking points.
Okay, that's good. All right, well, then here's the other thing I've learned is that the first big thing that we're trying to change here is what is called a frame. And I need to back up and tell you a little bit about that. So imagine you go to Chicago for the first time and it's raining. You go to Chicago the second time and it's raining. And you say, it's always raining in Chicago. You go back the third time, it's dry. Fourth time, wonderful day. Fifth time, fantastic. What's the weather like in Chicago? It's always raining in Chicago. Because that first frame that you chose to predict what was going to happen then becomes a confirmation bias. You only see things that support it, and you don't see the things that don't. Back in 1965, a group of conservative politicians got together and they put two words together that had never been next to each other before: tax burden. Before then, you might say, well, may not be crazy about paying taxes, but that's how we got Al Capone after all, right? Because, if you're a good citizen, you pay your taxes. Well, tax burden, if you accept that as a frame, after a while, it's only tax burden or tax relief. So building the frame is very powerful. The second piece is repetition. That phrase, tax burden, has been repeated over and over and over since 1965. And the more the first time you hear it, you might think, oh, that's weird. The second time, it's like, yeah, I've heard that. Third time is, yeah, I hear that a lot. And now tax burden is used so often, you will find it on your tax form, how to calculate your tax burden. I believe that idea, and this is my focusing on conservative, by that I just mean focus against taxation, this kind of libertarian idea against taxation. It has been the most successful campaign for over a generation, repeated over and over and over. And so I mention all that to say, these are the messages that we have to probably say, not just for 1 year or for one library campaign, but for as long as we're working in libraries. We have to say these things over and over. So the ones that test the best for messages have been libraries transform lives. You gave me something that completely changed my life. Libraries transform communities. That's my Colby story. We saved downtown by rebuilding Main Street. Librarians are passionate advocates for lifelong learning. And that's all speak with passion and great focus. And then this idea that libraries are a smart investment, that I'm not just throwing my money away, that every dollar I put into the library comes back to the community. So now, and I realize this doesn't leave us with a great deal of time, but I'm going to give you not very much time, about 2 minutes, to write a story right now that comes up with a real person. And I'm assuming that all of us have many stories like this. It could be a story about you, but I want you to tell it like it's somebody else. Give me a story that's a real person. They had a personal problem. There was something that the library did to help them address that ended well. One fact, and feel free to make it up since I know you're not in front of all of your statistics right now. And then give me a phrase that pays, that falls into the messages on the right-hand side of the screen. So I'm going to give you 2 minutes to write that right now. And then I'm going to ask one or two of you to tell us your story. And so I'm just going to leave this on the screen so you have a chance to sketch that out. And I'm not asking you to type this in the chat, just on your own piece of paper. And I may, now, if I stop the show, you won't be able to see all the choices. Never mind. All right, I think I will move to my next 2 slides, and then I'm going to come back for that final story. My parting thoughts, what I want you to take from this is that we don't have to invent new messages, and we really shouldn't be coming up with new advocacy campaigns every year, because even if we can change the frame, we have to keep repeating it. Advocacy is not the work of a season, it's the work of a generation. This whole idea that librarians are in the information business, I don't think is true. I think we are in the story gathering phase. And then I will send all of these slides so that you will have copies of them. But just last week, some people that had taken this workshop in the past got together and they put together 2 marvelous books. And they're free downloads. Library Storytelling Team Guidebook is one about, it kind of goes through some of the things I've talked about here, but it adds something new. And that second one, this idea of guidebook for story reporters, they get into some statement that I really hadn't thought about, and that's the statement of public value. So remember I mentioned that there's this kind of statement of one fact, 132 people. 132 people have read to dogs. But the real issue there, the value, was the importance of early literacy. And we have to find a way to be powerful storytellers where it may not be the librarians doing the storytelling, but the story gatherers, the story crafters, to give to other people to then go out and begin changing the frame and the way people think about libraries. So I'm going to stop sharing. There's my email, and I encourage all of you at any time to email me if you have follow-up questions.
Jamie, we did have a question from one of the participants. I think they're listening to you talk about storytelling, and their question is, do we need to be wary of being emotionally manipulating of our users, of these people, especially when we're doing this storytelling exercise?
You know, I've had, you're not the first person to raise that question to me. People often say that is it dishonest to try to manipulate people? And I look at it like this: everybody is advertising. Everyone is doing this. Some of them are doing it well, some are doing it poorly. And I believe this is that it's not manipulation to tell the truth, to tell a human story of transformation that happened in the library. And so there are other questions that you may want to think about, and the books that I cited there too also get into this, particularly in small and more rural areas. You don't want to, you know, they may recognize who the person is that you're talking about. You know, so there are some steps that you have to do to make sure that you're ensuring the confidentiality. But I also think that if libraries within a region can get together and share stories among themselves, we can use each other's stories. And so the question is, it's not so much, you know, it's not about manipulation. It's about securing the viability of our institutions. We have to change the way people look at us, and stories is the way to do it. Okay, so I'm going to jump over here and say, do we have any other questions?
Can I ask one?
Yes, please.
Given the political climate in Colorado that created the Tabor Act, which is what I think you're referring to in your previous discussion, how effective do you think your new philosophy of storytelling would have been if you had had that tool and just applied it right then and there?
So what we wound up doing after we lost that election is completely changed the way we talked about this and the way we went through marketing. And we went back to each of our communities to say, here's our issue. If we have to wait to build this library, you know, to wait much longer time, you are not going to see the advantages of having us as an anchor store downtown. Your choice is that if you give us the land right now, we might be able to go faster. And so by talking all the time about the values that we, you know, are the contribution that we made to the community, we wound up getting donations of land totaling well over the tax increase we had tried to ask for several years earlier. So I think the bottom line is that this is more emotionally intelligent. It is more systematic. It is more thoughtful, more strategic. And I think it would have made a big difference. Does anybody have any stories they want to share with me? I know we're probably...
I had one question that had come up that I kind of overlooked, and it was about using the GIS data. And I think people were wondering if you had any kind of universal resources that they could use to start kind of using that to find out about their community.
Yeah, here's what I find is that virtually every county or town has somebody in that unit who is already doing something with GIS. And they're pathetically eager to share that information because it's a marvelous tool and not everybody has a good use for it. It's a fantastic tool for library planning. So just go and start asking around in the IT department to find out, or usually community planning will have that data. So I've got a story here. It says a girl placed in foster care came to the library regularly. Later said she loved the library because she felt she was part of the community, was placed back home. A few weeks later, was placed in foster care again by the same foster parent. She talked to the driver the whole way about how excited she was to come back because between the foster parent and the friend she had from the library who cared about her and helped her make good decisions. Library is a place where people can find friends and help creating a stronger future generation. Okay, so here's what I've learned about these kind of writing things is you have to workshop them. You have to, you know, so writing it down is step one, fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing. But then it's like, now you go back and give me a real name. Who's the girl? I want something that's specific about that. Tell me specifically what the library did about it. And then at the end, see what happened. You know, I look for that fact, and I'm not finding the fact that anchors it. And then we are so tempted to do this, is to come up with a new values proposition, a new phrase that pays. But recognize that the folks that we're trying to persuade to invest in the library are getting an anti-tax message all the time that doesn't change. So if we have a new message every time, we're not going to be successful. So that's right, Gail. Just add that libraries transform lives at the end. So and again, I'm running a little late and I apologize for that, but I will send, again, I saw that you repeated out the sources for those books, but I will now send a copy of my slide deck to Dan and Mary Beth here, and feel free to share it and follow up with any other questions.
Thank you so much, Jamie. This was such a good session. I learned so much. I have a page full of notes. I'm excited to read some of those books you suggested. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you everybody else for coming. We will have a survey that we will email out to you, but I'm going to put the link here in the chat for everyone. It is an evaluation of our after lunch course. We'd like to know what you liked about it and where we can improve. There are 3 more sessions, one in June, one in September, and one in December. I don't have that in front of my face. Dan, do you have those dates?
Yeah, we'll do customer service in June. It's library ethics in September, and Mr. LaRue will be back with us in December to do that 20-second talk. It's an HR conversation.
Wonderful. So thank you everybody for joining us, and we hope you have the good rest of your afternoon.
Great to see you all. Thanks for participating. We'll see you hopefully in a couple months.
Thank you all.
Thanks,
Thank
Jamie.
you, Jamie.